Welcome to Future Talk. On today's program, we're going to be talking to prominent futurist and sociobiologist Rebecca Costa. Rebecca has written a fascinating book called The Watchmen's Rattle, Thinking Our Way Out of Extinction. She says that the human race is facing disaster unless we change our thinking habits, and she tells us which of our old thinking habits we need to abandon and which new ones we need to embrace. The book has received high praise from people like Richard Branson, Donald Trump, former Senator Bill Bradley, and leading scientists around the world. And some people have even called it a game changer. Rebecca is the daughter of a Japanese mother and an American father who served with the Central Intelligence Agency during the Vietnam War. She grew up in Japan and attributes her ability to spot global patterns to her cross-cultural upbringing. Today, she lives in California, and among her other accomplishments, she was the founder and CEO of a successful Silicon Valley advertising company that dealt with many of the Valley's best-known firms, and that was later sold to advertising giant J. Walter Thompson. She also hosts her own radio show in the Monterey area. Also with us, serving as my co-host, is Mei-Lin Feng, co-producer of Future Talk. Mei-Lin is also the founder and chairman of the Institute for Service Organization Excellence. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Good to have you today. Let's start with the title of your book. What do you mean by the Watchmen's Rattle?
Well, in earlier times, when we put together the first police forces, they didn't carry weapons. They actually carried these wooden rattles with them that would make a loud noise in the middle of the night and would summons help if they saw wrongdoing. And so, to a certain extent, this book is a summons for people to pay attention, to wake up, and to come and help each other.
So you're sounding an alarm?
I am sounding an alarm, yes.
And what should we be alarmed about? What are the big problems that we should be worried about?
Well, I think when we look around today, people are very constricted and paralyzed by the amount of complexity that they have to deal with in day-to-day life. For example, I just spoke at one of the major universities on an environmental sustainability day, and I noticed that the first speaker that came up was talking about the benefits of composting and using organic fertilizers and any number of things. And then they took a 5-minute break, and of course when the first speaker was talking, all the students were diligently writing down everything that he said. They took a 5-minute break, and then the next speaker came on and he said, well, composting isn't a good idea because it produces methane gas, one of the most harmful things for the environment. And he said, and by the way, organic fertilizers have tons of nitrates in them which leach into the water table, and that's not good. So of course then the students were crossing off all these alternatives. We're so paralyzed by the complexity that we have to deal with. Nobody can explain the derivatives market. We don't know if vaccines are good or not good for us, whether they cause autism.
So you're saying we need to make things more simple, they're too complicated, and we have to somehow simplify them?
Well, we have to remember that we're trapped in a biological spacesuit. And whether we like it or not, this biological spacesuit is governed by the rate at which we can adapt and create new evolutionary features. So the big discovery here is that human societies cannot progress any faster than evolution will permit. We simply cannot have levels of complexity that our brains and our emotions cannot handle.
But doesn't biological evolution take an enormous time to develop at all? I mean, that's practically negligible over the course of a few generations, isn't it?
That's correct. Many, many millions of years. Now take human progress that's moving in picoseconds. Eventually, we can argue whether it's today or next month or next year, but eventually the clocks must meet.
So you're saying that our technology is getting too complicated for us to deal with properly?
Well, I don't know about you, but I don't need any more apps for my cell phone. Please don't give me any more. And I don't understand why I have so many pieces of software that come with my PC. I see all these icons at the bottom of my computer, and I don't need all those. I don't even want them. And I don't have the time to discover whether I would ever use them.
So is the problem that we have too much complexity, or we're simply not intelligent enough to deal with the complexity we have?
there's a limit to what the brain can decipher and manage. We may not like to come face to face with that, but at some point we have to realize that ancient civilizations came up against that cognitive limit as well. I call that the cognitive threshold. And we see that for a period of time, they do very well. They thrive, they have a lot of progress, they invent new technologies, but something happens and they begin to get gridlocked. They hit some kind of a cognitive ceiling in which they don't have the biological capability to understand their most dangerous and threatening problems. So the first step is we see a gridlock occur. For example, for the Mayans, they knew they had drought problems for many thousands of years. But at a certain point, they stopped building reservoirs, underground cisterns, canals. They stopped using crop rotation, and they began reverting exclusively to fetishism to solve the drought problem. So the second step is, after we become gridlocked and we're no longer able to solve our most dangerous problems, we seem to revert to trying to solve them on unproven beliefs only, and we abandon the pursuit of rational knowledge.
Now, what do you feel we should do about the problem? We have all this complexity, it's running our lives, and we feel we're not in control. Can we back out of it, or can we make ourselves better equipped?
I don't think there's any hope we're going to slow innovation and progress and technology down. The internet was just part of it. Right now, we're having trouble with search engines because they don't seem to be working anymore. I don't know about you, but when I go to do research, I get pages and pages and pages. And, you know, having a million choices of something is the same as having none. I can't process a million alternatives. So, you know, is there a way out? Yes, there is, because when we get to a point where we can't be good pickers and we can't pick the things that'll work from those that won't work, then we have to go to high failure rate models.
Hey, Malin, do you have any questions?
Yeah, Rebecca, I'm so fascinated by your bringing in the idea of complexity and saying that we need new responses to this complexity. So we have some slides about how complexity is driving us to beliefs. Could you say a few words about that?
Well, similar to the Mayans, when we get to a point where we can't discern the facts or the facts are not available to allow us to solve our most dangerous problems, then we have a tendency in all civilizations prior to collapse that we rely exclusively on unproven beliefs. Now, what are beliefs? I don't mean religious beliefs. When I talk about beliefs, I'm talking about anything that is unproven. So, for example, the idea that vaccines might cause autism.
Yep.
Or that climate change may not be real.
Yes.
Or is real. I mean, those might be considered beliefs. Until you can substantiate something, including putting your money in the bank. You put your money in the bank and you think that it'll be there when you want to take it out. You don't know it's going to be there, so you just have a belief that it's safe in the bank.
Yes.
So human beings need beliefs to function.
Yeah.
And this has always been true. Going back to earlier prehistoric times, we drew little idols on the cave walls to help us catch bigger prey or to make the females more fertile. So we find that human societies, during the periods of time when they're thriving and they're progressing the most, there's an accommodation for both the pursuit of knowledge and facts and beliefs.
Yes.
It's when we begin abandoning factual data and we begin relying completely on beliefs that public policy becomes irrational. And this is the beginning of the descent of civilizations.
So this is why you've got this provocative tagline, thinking our way out of extinction, because you're really seeing some signs, just like the Mayans went into fetish behavior in the face of the drought. You're seeing signs in our society that should really cause us to rethink what we're doing. I think we've got another slide that this is amazing thing that you said in your book. We live in a time with Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, but with godlike technology. And this is a dangerous situation. Professor E.O. Wilson of Harvard wrote the foreword to your book. Can you tell us a little bit about why he felt this is where we are and what you and he think we should be doing about it?
Well, for a long time now, Dr. Wilson and I have been concerned about the fact that there seems to be no connecting of the dots between man as a biological creature and the troubles that we're currently facing. We don't seem to want to accept that we're all trapped in a biological spacesuit that has limitations. We can't run a mile in 10 seconds. We can't lift 100,000 pounds over our heads. And the human brain can only evolve new features over many millions of years. And so when you begin outstripping what the human brain can do, you're going to have symptoms like gridlock and the inability to get to or process facts. And so increasingly human beings revert to beliefs, which makes them vulnerable to false prophets.
Yes, I think we've got a slide on that too.
For
Bernie
example,
Madoff.
Bernie Madoff. You hit the nail on the head. Bernie Madoff, you know, the people who invested with Bernie Madoff, they weren't people who had $50 in savings. These were very sophisticated investors. And they had been in the market a long time. But when nobody can explain derivatives, I don't think anybody in the world could explain that to me in a way that I could understand it. When you get someone that says, don't worry about it, I know how to make you money, it's very complicated. Just turn over the family jewels, and you have these sophisticated investors. What more proof do you need that it's become, the financial markets have become too complex for even sophisticated investors to be responsible for their own nest eggs, let alone you or me?
Yeah, but there was another factor, and this just came out this week with Bernie Madoff saying the banks and the investment banks were funneling money. They had to know that this was a fraud they were participating in, so that when people get to this dangerous situation of going after belief, there in fact are the con artists and the snake oil salesmen who jump on the bandwagon and push us for their own personal benefit.
Of course, and we are the willing participants in that because things are too complicated. I mean, even look at politics. These last midterm elections, I found myself standing in the voting booth, looking at all these ballot measures and realizing in a moment of absolute clarity and truth that I had not researched any of the issues on my own, and I was about ready to cast my vote based on lawn signs in my neighbor's yards that I tend to agree with, and 30-second commercials. Now, if I'm going to be that irrational, what kind of public policy am I going to wind up with?
My goodness. Marty.
Rebecca, you talk in your book about something that you call memes, which are kind of bad thinking habits that we keep on persisting in. Can you give an example of one such bad thinking habit that's hindering us from solving our problems?
Well, extreme economics is one example that I give in my book of a hindrance to progress in society. Right now, we are at a point in time where whether something makes money or pays for itself has become the ultimate litmus test as to whether it's valid. And this just simply isn't true. There are some things that will not fit ever into an economic model, and yet we're force-fitting it into some kind of economic model. For example, healthcare. We're trying to force that in, or protecting the environment and not devastating all the resources that we have. Clean water. How are we going to fit these things into an economic model? There are some things that are good for humankind that have nothing to do with whether they pay for themselves or they make money.
But can we get beyond economics? Because usually if somebody does useful work, they expect to be paid for it, and if they're not going to get paid for it, they probably won't do it unless they're working on a volunteer basis, and not that many people do that.
You know, there are millions of people that volunteer all over the planet. And when they volunteer, they are appealing effectively to the higher instruments of their genetic nature, which is altruism, compassion, to work collaboratively and not to compete for scarce resources. These we also inherited. But if you think about our evolutionary inheritance as one basket is our lower inheritance, greed, competitiveness, hoarding, cheating on our spouses.
So you're saying that people should place the well-being of the collective above their individual selves, and if so, how are you going to get people to do that?
I'm saying that that's in one basket. We have the higher instruments of our genetic inheritance, and we can appeal to that. That's why I wrote this book. We don't have to react. If you think about the human body, it doesn't just have predispositions for cancer and diabetes and heart disease, which we all accept. It also has predispositions for behavior. We're hardwired to behave in certain ways. We don't have to, we have free will, but to deny that we have a predisposition to fight people that have a foreign ideology or a culture when we feel threatened, it's just simply not true. It's how our ancestors survived. In natural selection, those who fought tribes with foreign ideologies and cultures, they were the genetic survivors. So we are flooded with chemicals in our bodies when we come across a foreign ideology. Now we can either react to those chemicals and pick a fight, or even worse, pick a war, or we can respond. We can think about it. We can call upon the higher instrument of our genetic inheritance, something other animals don't have and haven't perfected as the human has, which is our ability to preview, to look ahead, see the consequences of our actions, reverse engineer that consequence, and choose through free will not to react in a way that our ancestors did.
But isn't part of the problem that people have conflicting desires? They both want to possess the same object, for example, and it can't be divided in half. So the one that fights more aggressively will probably be the one that gets it, and they'll say, well, my aggressive strategy worked, it paid off, so I'll keep doing that. In other words, I don't know if people are thinking about the collective. They're thinking, what works for me? What's the best strategy for me to maximize my benefits?
But bear in mind, when human tribes, when prehistoric tribes collaborated, when they cooperated, they caught bigger prey, they were able to fend off larger animals. They all did better when they collaborated and they cooperated. A single organism out in the wild has the least chance of surviving. It's when the group, the collective, work together that we have the best opportunity for survival and the highest opportunity for the propagation of our young and for progressing. We don't progress well when we compete individually.
Okay, Maylin, any questions?
Yeah, I actually wanted to shift to what you see as a longer-term solution response to the place that we're at now, the gridlock of knowledge and beliefs. You said that there's a left brain thinking where we're basing on facts, and then our right brain emotional response. But that's not all. There's this third thing. Can we have the slide? Insight.
Yes.
And that insight is something where you tell a story about, in your book, about this fellow firefighter called Wag Dodge. Tell us that story.
In 1949, 16 smoke jumpers were called out to a fire in Man Gulch in Montana.
I think, yes, here we go.
Mm-hmm. And it was one of the worst forest fire disasters in the country's history, because out of the 16, 13 perished. Mm-hmm. Wag Dodge was the captain of the 16, and they jumped into the Man Gulch. It was a pretty traditional fire, but literally minutes after they landed, the wind shifted and they became trapped. Yes. All the firefighters became trapped between the fire and a very, very steep canyon. Yeah. The firefighters, Wag immediately told them to drop their equipment and to run, and they started to try to scale the canyon, but he saw that the fire was moving at about 700 feet per minute and that they were not going to be able to outrun the fire. So in a moment of complete insanity, this is 1949, he turned around and started running toward the fire and lighting the grass on the ground, and they thought he had lost his mind, and he ordered his crew to do the same. He doesn't know, later he was interviewed, he had no idea why he did this. But he lit the ground around him, and then he grabbed a handkerchief, wet it, and pulled his firefighting equipment, jacket over him and allowed the inferno to pass over him. It was the first time that a firefighter had built a safety zone by burning the fuel around the area, and he survived the fire. And 2 others that found some cracks in the canyons and hid there that were very badly harmed, they survived as well. But 13 smoke jumpers died that day. Later, Wag Dodge was asked, what made you think to burn the fuel around you? He was a very ordinary man. He was a volunteer firefighter. He had no history of having these insights. But when you think about insights, they're the thing of folklore. Newton had an apple dropped on his head. Archimedes got into a tub and watched the water spill over the sides and discovered displacement theory. Now, for the first time in human history, we can put skull caps on humans and give them increasingly complex problems. So the first thing we do is we wind up using our left side of our brain and use logic and deconstruction. And sometimes we use the synthesis of the right side of the brain. But as the problems become more and more complex and there's more variables and the variables are acting dynamically, at some point the left and the right sides of our brain, the kinds of problem solving we are capable of doing there, it just peters out. We hit a ceiling. Every now and then, spontaneously, a little part of our brain called the ASTG lights up like a Christmas tree. 300 milliseconds before we're going to connect information we have in a novel way in which we've never done it before and have a breakthrough. And when everyone knows in science, when you get to a point where you can predict a behavior and you know a person's going to have a breakthrough, you are on to something. So we know there is a third form of problem solving, and every human being can be observed to have this regardless of their educational background. So this is something organic inside the human body, and we just don't have control over it. I'd like to have insights every day of my life. I'd like to induce them, but we just don't know how to do that.
So I'm seeing something that's almost like the point where people said everybody needs to learn to read and write. You're sort of saying that for the complexity, everybody needs to cultivate this skill of insight. And what is the way that we can educate people or help us develop more insight more regularly when it's needed at this difficult time?
Well, there's a third of my book, as you know, is devoted to what we know about insight. And people say, well, you didn't tell us enough. Well, it's a nonfiction book. I can't make things up that we don't know yet. This is breaking neuroscience. So I have to make that disclaimer first. But one of the things that we do know is that you can't connect data you don't have. So it's very important that you have as much content as possible. I'm not going to come up with some breakthrough in physics if I've never cracked open a physics book. So it's not a miracle. So the more content you have, the more likely you can make these novel connections. So the trick is, how can you load content quickly? And when we find that neuroscientists are developing these brain fitness tools, and I'm not talking about the gaming company tools, but I am talking about brain fitness tools developed by neuroscientists that allow us to load and retain content at a much faster rate. And we feel that that will be the breakthrough as we move forward.
Okay. Earlier on, we were talking about other ways to cultivate insight, where, for example, in investment, some people are amazingly insightful about being like George Soros, making a killing on the exchange rate. But there are other examples of investors who have developed that insight. And you said women who had got together in the Midwest.
Collaboration. You know, in the face of complexity, where you have one of the definitions of complexity that came out of Harvard is there are more wrong choices than there are right ones, and the wrong ones are exponentially growing. So you become an incompetent picker. So one of the things that you have to realize is when you collaborate, you have a better chance of selecting the right investments. So these groups that are getting together in the Midwest and in New York, and their investment groups, and they're sharing information, they tend to do very, very well. Another thing is, if you know you're in a high failure rate, then you have to use a model for high failure rate. And so you want to go to things like venture capital models. If you know you're trying to solve a problem like the Gulf oil spill, for example, and you know there's a great sense of urgency, you cannot get a bunch of smart people in a room and decide this is the solution and we're going to pick it. Look what happened. The first solution we came up with is drop a concrete box on the hole, And 30 days later, we found out that didn't work. Then we went into the next solution, which was we were going to drill from the side and relieve some of the pressure and oil. 30 days later, we found out that didn't work. That is the most ridiculous way to go about solving a problem that has a sense of urgency. When you become an incompetent picker because there are more wrong solutions than there are right ones, you must go at it like a venture capitalist does, who knows that no amount of due diligence is going to allow him to pick the winners more than 15% of the time. So they invest in 100 companies, and 15 strike gold, and 85 don't get second and third and fourth round funding.
So,
Rebecca, is inspiration something natural? I mean, do people have to work to be inspired, which I think is the same thing as insight, or is it a natural function, but most people have too much static going on inside their brains to hear the inspiration?
We know that a certain amount of quiet time is required. We know that you need a large amount of content. We know that blood flow to the brain, exercise, helps insight. We even know that walking on uneven surfaces helps you think better.
So any kind of stimulation, anything that's different, gives you a little
The reason uneven surfaces works is because fundamentally that's why we got the prefrontal cortex, is it developed when we became bipedal. So when we're walking on uneven surfaces, we're really exercising the brain. The brain wants to be warmed up. It's just like a marathon runner stretching and hydrating and doing things to prepare to do something difficult. Insight is a cognitively very, very pricey exercise. It's almost as though we see areas of the brain shutting down, getting ready, preparing to use this third form of problem solving. There's all kinds of indication that we are not evolved enough to be able to use it every day.
Now, I'd love to ask you a lot more questions, but I've just got the signal that we're just about out of time. So we are going to have to wrap the show. I'd like to thank our guest, Rebecca Costa, sociobiologist and author of the highly acclaimed book, The Watchmen's Rattle, Thinking Our Way Out of Extinction, and Mei-Lin Feng, co-host, co-producer of this program. Thank you for watching. Visit our website, www.futuretalk.net. I'm Marty Wasserman. We'll see you next time.
bye.